And, of course, this guy lasted 5 minutes, and he was gone. So I was right.
Eddie Van Halen stepped into a small pawn shop on a quiet afternoon, scanning the shelves the way only he could, like a man searching for hidden treasure in plain sight. He wasn't there to buy anything flashy or new. He was hunting for forgotten pieces, scraps of potential that others had overlooked. That day, the owner tried to sell him a broken guitar for just $5. But what he said next, that stayed with Eddie for the rest of his life. It was a Thursday in March 1977, and in just 6 months, Van Halen would release their debut album, one that would shake the foundations of rock music forever. Everything seemed to be falling into place. They had a contract with Warner Brothers Records, a producer who believed in them, and a catalog of explosive songs ready to be unleashed. But there was one thing they didn't have yet: money.
Alex, Mike, and I were just pretty devastated, really. We were just sitting there going, now what, you know?
The advance they received had barely covered the essentials: studio time, rent, and survival. So Eddie kept doing what he had always done, digging through pawn shops and garage sales, searching for old parts he could bring back to life, tuning pegs, bridge saddles, pickups, anything that could help him build or improve the guitars he obsessed over. Buying brand new gear from a music store, that was still out of reach. That was for people who had already made it. Eddie didn't come from that world. His father, Jan Van Halen, had raised him and his brother Alex Van Halen to work with what they had, to create, to adapt, to never waste. Eddie had built his first serious guitar using salvaged pieces, teaching himself to see beyond scratches and dents. Where others saw something broken, he saw possibility. Where others heard noise, he heard music waiting to happen. To Eddie, pawn shops weren't desperate places. They were gold mines for those who knew what to look for. This particular shop, the Pasadena Exchange, sat quietly between a dry cleaner and a check cashing store along Colorado Boulevard. Eddie had been there a couple of times before, never leaving with anything, but always leaving with the feeling that one day something worthwhile would be waiting for him there. Because that's how he thought. The best discoveries in his mind were usually hiding where no one else cared to look. Behind the counter stood Roy Pittman, a heavy-set man in his 50s who ran the place. The shop was packed with the usual mix: cameras, jewelry, tools, but also a rotating selection of musical gear that kept Eddie coming back. He liked to track what changed, almost like he had a mental inventory of the entire store.
In a weird way, isn't he?
Well, he had addiction problems like my father had, but Eddie wasn't violent. You know, that was the only great, beautiful thing about Eddie.
That afternoon, just after 2 o'clock, Eddie pushed the door open, wearing his usual look: tight black jeans, a worn-out concert T-shirt from a gig he had worked years earlier, and boots that had clearly seen better days. His dark hair was wild, unpolished, and unmistakably him. He didn't look like a future legend. He looked like what he was, a young, hungry musician in his mid-20s, standing on the edge of something massive the world hadn't noticed yet. Roy glanced up from behind the counter, holding up a finger as he finished speaking to another customer about a reel-to-reel tape machine. Eddie nodded slightly and waited, already scanning the room. Eddie didn't rush. He never did in places like this. Instead, he moved through the shop with quiet focus, hands tucked into his pockets, eyes carefully scanning every wall, every shelf, every forgotten corner. To anyone else, it might have looked like aimless browsing, but for Eddie, it was a process, a ritual. The usual collection of worn-out instruments filled the space. A couple of cheap acoustic guitars with warped necks hung crookedly on the wall. A dented trumpet sat in a glass case. A violin with a cracked top rested beside a dusty ukulele missing 2 strings. Nothing special, nothing worth stopping for. And then he saw it. Tucked away in the far corner, leaning against the wall like it had been abandoned, was a solid-body electric guitar that looked like it had completely given up on life. Once painted a rich cherry red, The finish had faded unevenly into a dull pink, with patches worn all the way down to bare wood along the edges and the back of the neck. The headstock had a noticeable chip. Two of the tuning machines didn't match the others. The pickguard was split down the middle, barely held together by a strip of old electrical tape that had left a permanent shadow behind. There was no price tag. Eddie crouched down in front of it but didn't touch it. Not yet. He just studied it, completely still, for nearly half a minute, taking it in, listening with his eyes before ever using his hands.
We were just a little bit, no, we weren't a little bit. We were a lot pissed off.
Finally, he stood up and turned back toward the counter, waiting patiently for Roy to finish his conversation. When the customer with the reel-to-reel machine finally left, Roy stepped out from behind the counter with the easy confidence of someone who knew every inch of his shop. "Find anything?" he asked casually. Eddie nodded toward the corner. "What's the story on that one?" Roy glanced over his shoulder, barely interested. "That thing, guy brought it in about 8 months ago. Didn't know what it was, couldn't prove ownership on anything decent. I gave him $12 for it, figured I'd look into it later." He shrugged. "Never did. It's just been sitting there. Was thinking of tossing it in the clearance bin." Eddie's eyes stayed locked on the guitar. "How much do you want for it?" Roy looked at it the way people look at something they've already decided is worthless. $5, he said. "It's broken. Electronics are shot. One tuner doesn't even turn. I don't know if the truss rod works either. Honestly, it's not worth a serious guitarist's time." There was a pause. Eddie looked at him, calm and unreadable. "Can I pick it up?" Roy gave a small shrug, gesturing with open hands. "Be my guest." Eddie walked back to the corner and carefully lifted the guitar with both hands. He didn't plug it in. He didn't strum it. Instead, he turned it slowly, almost reverently, like he was holding something fragile and important. His thumb ran along the neck. He tilted the headstock, studying it from different angles. He pressed lightly against the body in a few spots, then raised it toward the front window, letting the natural light reveal every flaw and every hidden strength. His fingernail traced the binding where it met the top. Then he sighted down the neck from the headstock, just like a carpenter checking a piece of wood, searching for warps, twists, anything out of alignment. Finally, he gave the body a soft tap near the upper bout and listened. It was a trick he'd picked up years earlier from an old repairman named Frank Duca, a man who believed you could tell almost everything about an instrument just from the sound it made when you tapped it. A weak structure would answer with a dull, lifeless thud, but a strong one? That would sing back, even unplugged, clear, alive, full of tension and possibility. This one rangs. Roy watched from behind the counter, mildly curious now, like someone seeing a stranger take interest in something he'd already dismissed. Eddie kept his eyes on the guitar as he spoke, almost under his breath. "This is a Gibson ES-335. Roy blinked, caught off guard. "That thing?" 1958, Eddie continued calmly. "First year they made them. One of the earliest thin-line semi-hollow electrics Gibson ever produced." Now Roy was really looking. "The finish is gone," Eddie said, still studying the instrument. "Electronics need a full rebuild, but the body's solid." He paused, gently gripping the neck joints tight. And in that moment, what Roy saw as junk, Eddie saw as something else entirely. The bracing underneath is intact. Eddie pressed lightly against the lower bout again, feeling for any weakness hidden beneath the surface. Then he nodded to himself, certain now. "You can feel it," he said quietly. "Nothing's collapsed in there." Roy stepped out from behind the counter and came closer, drawn in despite himself. He stood beside Eddie, looking down at the same battered guitar. But now he wasn't seeing junk anymore. He was seeing a question, one he hadn't even realized he should be asking. "How much is it worth?" Roy said. But this time, his voice had changed. There was something else in it now, uncertainty, maybe even a hint of concern. Eddie carefully placed the guitar back against the wall, exactly the way he had found it, treating it with the same respect as if it were already restored. "Fixed up properly?" Eddie said, thinking it through. "You're probably looking at somewhere between $800 and $1,200, maybe more depending on the work and the buyer." He paused for just a moment. "But as it is?" "To the right person. Someone who knows what they're looking at?" He glanced back at it. "Probably around $400 to $500. Roy's eyes widened slightly. He stared at the guitar, then back at Eddie. But this time, he wasn't just seeing a customer anymore. He was studying him, really noticing him for the first time since he walked through the door. "Who are you?" Roy asked. Eddie didn't hesitate. "Eddie Van Halen," he said simply. "I play guitar." The name meant nothing to Roy. Not yet. In March of 1977, Van Halen hadn't released a single album. There were no radio hits, no headlines, no global fame. Just a growing reputation in clubs, backyard parties, and whispered conversations across Southern California. To Roy, Eddie was just a young guy in worn boots, who clearly knew a lot more than he let on. "You want it?" Roy asked after a moment. "Still $5?" Eddie looked at the guitar again. Then he looked at Roy. "You should sell it for what it's worth," Eddie said. There was no hesitation in his voice, no second guessing. "Find someone who restores vintage Gibson guitars," he continued. "There are a few guys around the valley who'd pay you a fair price and actually do right by it." He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and grabbed a pen. Quickly, he wrote down 2 names and phone numbers before handing it over. "Call either of them," Eddie said. "Tell them what you've got, and don't let anyone talk you below $300 for it as is." Roy took the paper slowly, looked at it, then back at the guitar, then back at Eddie. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, genuinely confused. "You could have bought it for $5. Flipped it yourself." Eddie didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into a small bin on the counter and picked up a set of old tuning machines, the kind of parts he'd actually come in looking for. He turned them in his hand briefly, then set them down. "How much for these?" Roy blinked, still processing everything. $2. Eddie placed the money on the counter without hesitation. "I came in for parts," he said calmly, "not to take advantage of someone who didn't know what they had." With that, he picked up the tuning machines and headed toward the door, just as quietly as he had entered. Roy Pittman stood there, frozen behind the counter. In one hand, he held a small piece of paper with 2 phone numbers. Across the room, a guitar he had nearly thrown into a clearance bin suddenly looked very different. And in that moment, something shifted. It wasn't just surprise, it was discomfort, the kind that creeps in when you realize you've been missing something important for a very long time. He thought about the past 11 years running that shop, all the instruments that had passed through his hands, all the ones he'd priced based on appearance, on wear and tear, on gut instinct, not on what they truly were. And for the first time, he wondered how many times he had let something valuable slip away, simply because he didn't recognize it. How many other $5 guitars had walked right out his door? And maybe the bigger question, the one that stayed with him long after Eddie left, how many people in the world were just like him? Roy didn't wait. That same afternoon, still feeling the weight of what had just happened, he picked up the phone and called the first number on the list. By the next morning, a vintage guitar restorer named Pete Haskell walked into the shop. He didn't waste time with small talk. He went straight to the corner, picked up the ES-335, and began examining it with the kind of focus Roy had seen the day before. 45 minutes later, the deal was done. Pete handed over $420 on the spot. 4 months after that, the same guitar, fully restored, its cherry finish glowing again, its electronics rebuilt to period-correct standards, every tuning machine perfectly matched, was sold through a vintage dealer in Hollywood for $1,100. It went to a studio musician who would go on to use it across 3 different albums over the next decade. But for Roy, the money was never the real story. The name was, because less than a year later, everything changed. In February 1978, Van Halen released their debut album. Suddenly, the radio was alive with something new. Running with the Devil blasted through speakers everywhere, and then came Eruption. That was different. That was the moment every guitarist in America stopped what they were doing and paid attention. Roy heard it too. And just like that, the memory came rushing back. That Thursday afternoon, that quiet kid in worn boots, that guitar in the corner. He turned the memory over in his mind again and again like an object he still hadn't fully figured out. For years, Roy told the story, but not as a story about regret. Not really. After all, he had turned $12 into $420 in less than a day. By any standard, that was a win. No, that's not why he told it. He told it because something about that moment didn't follow the rules. A broke young musician had walked into his shop, identified a 1958 Gibson ES 335 in under a minute, by sight, by feel, by instinct. And then did something Roy had never seen before. He told the truth. He didn't try to negotiate it down, didn't pretend it was worthless, didn't quietly take advantage of a situation that would have benefited him. Instead, he gave an honest appraisal and then handed over the opportunity. Roy had been in the pawn business long enough to understand how things worked. You paid what the seller was willing to accept, not what the item was truly worth. That wasn't considered dishonest. It was just the system, the foundation of every second-hand deal. Except that day, a 22-year-old guitarist decided not to play by those rules. Not for himself, not that day. Roy would later tell people, "I would have sold it to him for $5 and thanked him for taking it off my hands." And Eddie hadn't even considered it. Instead, he walked out with nothing more than a handful of old tuning machines, the parts he actually came for. Those same tuning machines would soon find their way onto a guitar Eddie was building back in his bedroom. It wasn't just any guitar, it was something entirely new. A black and white striped instrument pieced together from whatever he could find, an ash body from a lumber yard, a neck pulled from a Fender parts bin, pickups rewound to his exact specifications by a technician in Burbank. Every piece had a story. Every part had been hunted down, traded for, or rescued from obscurity. And at the center of it all was a technique Eddie had been quietly developing for years, using both hands on the fretboard in a way no one had ever fully explored before. That guitar would go on to become one of the most iconic instruments in rock history. And those $2 tuning machines Roy sold him, they held perfectly for years. Looking back, Roy came to understand something deeper. Some things that look worthless really are. But others, they're anything but. And the same goes for people. Because sometimes the person standing in front of you, wearing worn-out boots and a faded t-shirt, turns out to be exactly who they say they are. The difference, Roy realized, comes down to 2 things: knowing what you're looking at, and having the integrity to tell the truth about it, even when it costs you. Roy kept that small piece of paper, the one with the 2 phone numbers, for the rest of his life. He never threw it away. It stayed in his desk drawer through the years, through every deal, every lesson, every reminder. And when he finally closed the doors of the Pasadena Exchange in 1994, 17 years after that quiet Thursday afternoon, it was still there, a simple piece of paper, a reminder that one moment, one decision can show you more about the world then a lifetime of doing things the easy way. Years later, long after the doors of the Pasadena Exchange had closed for good, Roy Pittman would still find himself thinking about that afternoon, not as a business deal, but as a moment that quietly reshaped the way he saw everything. Because the truth was, the story didn't end with the guitar, or even with the rise of Eddie Van Halen. It stayed with him in the smaller moments, in every transaction that followed, in every customer who walked through his door, holding something they didn't fully understand. Roy began to slow down after that day. He asked more questions, looked a little closer, listened more carefully, not just to the objects, but to the people behind them. He realized that value wasn't always obvious, and more importantly, it wasn't always visible on the surface. And sometimes the real test wasn't whether you could recognize value. It was what you chose to do once you did. He told the story often, especially to younger shop owners just getting into the business. They expected a lesson about spotting rare items, about learning the trade, about maximizing profit. But Roy always took it somewhere else. It's not about the guitar, he'd say. It's about the choice. Because that's what stayed with him most. Not the money, not the missed opportunity, but the decision a young, unknown musician made in a quiet pawn shop when no one was watching, when no reputation was on the line, when it would have been easy, completely easy, to walk away with more than he paid for. Instead, Eddie walked away with exactly what he came for and nothing more. As the years passed and Van Halen became one of the biggest names in rock history, Roy would sometimes hear their music playing in the background of a store or on the radio in someone's car. And every time, without fail, he'd pause, not because of the fame, not because of the sound, but because he remembered the person behind it, before the world knew his name. A quiet guy with sharp eyes and stronger principles, and maybe that was the real legacy of that moment. Not the guitar, not the money, but the reminder that greatness doesn't just show up in talent. It shows up in character, long before anyone is paying attention.